Okay, so you've brought some pretty thought-provoking reports about the state of democracy globally. We've got analysis from Freedom House, an article from the Correspondent, and research from the German Marshall Fund of the United States. I'm hoping by the end of this deep dive, we'll all have a clearer understanding of the major trends impacting democracies around the world, why some experts are concerned, and what factors are contributing to their decline.
Yeah, well, what's really striking to me is that this isn't a sudden shift. We're not talking about a blip on the radar. Freedom House reports highlight a 12-year consecutive decline in global freedom. So that's over a decade, more than a decade of steady erosion, with 113 countries experiencing a net decline in political rights and civil liberties, compared to only 62 showing improvement.
Oh, that's a pretty bleak picture. What exactly is driving this downward spiral? Is it just a few bad actors, or is something more systemic at play here?
It's definitely a complex web of factors, but Freedom House points to the rise of populism and authoritarianism as major contributors. I mean, look at the rise of right-wing populist parties in Europe. They often tap into economic anxieties and a distrust of traditional institutions.
So instead of uniting people, these movements thrive on division. But is populism inherently incompatible with democracy?
Not necessarily, not inherently, no. But when populist leaders exploit those divisions and erode trust in democratic norms, and especially when they weaken those checks and balances, then it can create fertile ground for authoritarianism to take root. I mean, we've seen this happen in Hungary, for example, where Viktor Orban has really consolidated power, undermining the independence of the judiciary and the press.
So it's not just about holding elections, it's about having those underlying principles and institutions that ensures functioning democracy.
Exactly, you hit the nail on the head. And this is where the role of the United States becomes really crucial. Freedom House argues that America's shift away from its traditional role as a champion of democracy, has exacerbated the problem.
She specifically mentioned the America First policy and how that's been perceived globally.
Yeah, the policy itself has had an impact for sure, but it's the signal it sends that's perhaps even more significant. When the world's leading democracy seemingly prioritizes its own interests above global democratic norms, well, it creates a vacuum. And other actors like China and Russia are all too eager to fill that void.
Their approaches are very different.
Oh, absolutely. While Russia has become notorious for disinformation campaigns, interfering in elections, spreading propaganda, even allegedly supporting far-right groups, China's approach is much more subtle. They're using their economic might to expand their influence. Think of the Belt and Road Initiative. It offers tempting infrastructure projects and loans to developing nations, often creating economic dependence and aligning them with China's interests.
So it's like a two-pronged attack on democracy. One focused on sowing chaos and division, the other on strategic economic coercion.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And what's particularly concerning is that this global decline, it's mirrored by growing disillusionment with democracy, especially among younger generations.
Yeah, the German Marshall Fund's research really highlighted this generational gap. They found that only 41% of Americans consistently support democracy. With even lower support among younger age groups, it's alarming that the generation poised to inherit this system seems to be losing faith in it.
What I find interesting, though, is that their disillusionment isn't necessarily rooted in hostility towards democracy itself. It's more of a lack of understanding of how it works and a perception that it's failing to address the challenges they face. They view it as irrelevant and out of touch with their concerns.
The Correspondent article kind of echoes this. They point to a global trust deficit in democratic institutions. So is this sense of disillusionment solely a product of our current political climate, or are there deeper societal shifts at play?
I think it's a combination of factors. The 200-4/7 news cycle, the rise of social media, the proliferation of misinformation, all of these have eroded trust in traditional sources of information. And then you add in the increasing complexity and interconnectedness of global challenges. It can make it difficult for people to see how their individual actions can make a difference.
So it's a sense of both powerlessness and distrust that's fueling this disconnect.
Yes, and it creates a vicious cycle. As people disengage, democratic institutions weaken, further eroding trust. But there are glimmers of hope, like the success story of the Gambia.
Right. The Freedom House report highlighted the Gambia's recent transition from not free to partly free, following the departure of a long-ruling president. It does seem like a beacon of hope in a sea of democratic decline. What factors contributed to this positive change?
Well, the Gambian people themselves played a crucial role, demanding change and mobilizing for a democratic transition. But international pressure and support were also critical. Diplomatic efforts, economic sanctions, assistance with the transition process, all of these contributed to the eventual success.
This case study seems to suggest that even seemingly entrenched authoritarian regimes can be challenged and overturned.
It certainly demonstrates the potential for positive change, and it highlights the importance of both internal pressure and international solidarity in supporting democratic transitions. But it also raises questions about the effectiveness of our current models of democracy and whether they are truly representative of the people's will.
That kind of connects to the Correspondent article's discussion of Robert Dahl's concept of polyarchy.
Exactly. Dahl argued that true democracy in its purest form is almost impossible to achieve in large, complex societies. So he proposed the term polyarchy to describe a system where power is distributed among multiple groups and individuals. With citizens having a meaningful say in decision-making, it's a more nuanced and perhaps realistic way of thinking about democracy.
So it moves beyond the simplistic notion of majority rule and acknowledges the need for diverse representation and meaningful participation.
Precisely. And the Correspondent article takes this a step further, questioning whether our current electoral processes, with their emphasis on two-party systems and winner-take-all elections, truly reflect the will of the people.
So are they suggesting that we need to fundamentally rethink how we structure our democracies?
I think it's a conversation worth having, because if we're going to address this global decline, we need to ensure that our systems are truly responsive to the needs and aspirations of the people they are supposed to serve.
And that brings us to another critical issue, highlighted in several of the sources: the outsized influence of money in politics.
It's a challenge that undermines the very principle of one person, one vote. When wealthy individuals and corporations can pour vast sums into campaigns, it creates an uneven playing field, distorting representation and favoring the interests of the wealthy.
Kim Winger was particularly vocal about this. In their piece, Why Democracy is Broken, they argued for a complete ban on political donations.
It's a radical proposal for sure, but it highlights the deep-seated frustration many people feel about how money corrupts our political systems. The Correspondent article points to research showing that politicians are more responsive to their donors than to their constituents, leading to policies that benefit a select few at the expense of the many. This, in turn, fuels the cynicism and distrust we discussed earlier.
It's a vicious cycle that undermines faith in the system itself.
But it's a problem that demands innovative solutions. We need to explore ways to limit the influence of money, whether through campaign finance reforms, public financing of elections, or other creative approaches.
So it's not enough to simply lament the state of democracy. We need to actively seek solutions that can restore trust, empower citizens, and ensure that our systems are truly representative of the people.
Exactly. And that's what we'll delve into in the next part of our deep dive. We'll explore potential pathways for positive change, focusing on civic education, rebuilding trust in institutions, addressing the influence of money, and engaging younger generations.
Because ultimately, the future of democracy depends on our willingness to understand the challenges, engage in meaningful dialogue, and take action to ensure its survival. So we've painted a pretty stark picture of democracy's challenges. But let's shift gears a bit and talk about solutions. If we want to reverse this decline, where do we even begin?
Well, one recurring theme in all this research is the need for robust civic education. I mean, that German Marshall Fund study, it revealed a concerning lack of basic civic knowledge among younger generations. And it's not that they necessarily oppose democracy, it's more that they just don't fully grasp how it works or why it even matters.
So we've assumed that democracy would just kind of hum along on autopilot without us needing to really understand its mechanics or actively participate.
Yeah. Pretty much. And we need to go beyond just rote memorization of government structures. Civic education should foster a deep appreciation for democratic values, critical thinking skills, and the ability to engage in constructive dialogue, even with those who hold very different viewpoints.
So it's not just about knowing the rules of the game. It's about understanding why those rules exist.
Yeah.
And being equipped to participate meaningfully. But is knowledge enough? I mean, is it enough to overcome the cynicism and distrust that the Correspondent article highlighted?
Knowledge is definitely a crucial foundation, but rebuilding trust in democratic institutions, that's equally vital. When people feel like the system is rigged against them, they're much more susceptible to populist rhetoric and authoritarian solutions.
The Gambia case study showed the power of citizens demanding change. But that was a very specific context. How do we rebuild trust in established democracies? You know where the problems are more systemic and less about a single leader.
Transparency and accountability, those are key. Institutions need to be more open about their decision-making processes and demonstrate a genuine willingness to address shortcomings.
That's where a free and independent press comes in.
100%. A vigilant media is essential for holding power to account, exposing corruption, and informing the public. But the media itself is facing immense challenges in the digital age. You've got the rise of misinformation, the decline of local journalism, increasing pressure from governments and powerful interests. All of these threaten its ability to perform this vital role.
It does feel like a constant struggle these days, just to discern truth from falsehood in the current media landscape.
Which brings us back to civic education. Equipping citizens with critical thinking skills is more crucial now than ever. We need to help people develop the ability to evaluate sources, recognize bias, and engage in thoughtful dialogue, even amidst the cacophony of the digital world.
So it's about empowering people to be discerning citizens, not just passive consumers of information, easily swayed by whatever pops up on their screens. But even with greater awareness and participation, can we truly overcome the corrosive influence of money in politics? Kim Winger made a pretty compelling case for a complete ban on political donations. Is that the only solution?
Well, a complete ban definitely raises complex questions about free speech and political participation, but it does highlight the deep-seated frustration that many people feel about how money distorts our political systems.
The research is pretty clear that politicians are more responsive to their donors than to their constituents. It creates a system where wealth translates into political influence, and that undermines the principle of equal representation.
For sure. And that's where we need to explore a range of solutions, whether it's caps on donations, increased transparency in campaign financing, or even experimenting with public financing of elections. The goal is to create a more level playing field, where policies are driven by the needs of the people, not the interests of wealthy donors.
Okay, so we've talked about education, we've talked about trust and money. But what about the younger generations, those who are increasingly disengaged from democracy? How do we make this system relevant and appealing to them?
That's perhaps the most critical challenge we're facing. The German Marshall Fund research suggests that we need to move beyond that traditional model of democracy as simply voting in elections. We need to find ways to actually tap into their values and priorities.
And they seem particularly drawn to the concept of community, according to that research.
Exactly. Younger generations value collaboration, connection, and making a tangible difference. We need to find ways to bridge the gap between the abstract ideals of democracy and the concrete realities of their lives.
So could focusing on local engagement be the key?
It's definitely a promising avenue, empowering young people to address issues in their own communities. Whether it's environmental sustainability, social justice, or economic inequality, it can rekindle a sense of agency and demonstrate the power of collective action.
It's about showing them that democracy isn't just this distant concept, debated by politicians in some far-off capital. But it's a tool they can use to shape the world around them. But how do we translate that local engagement into a broader sense of democratic participation?
We need to create more opportunities for young people to have a voice in shaping policies that impact their lives. That can mean experimenting with youth councils, online platforms for civic engagement, or even lowering the voting age for certain local elections.
So it's about meeting them where they are, on their terms, and showing them that democracy can be a dynamic and responsive system that reflects their values and concerns.
Exactly. And it's also about fostering a culture of mentorship and intergenerational dialogue, where older generations share their experience and wisdom while actively listening to and learning from the perspectives of younger generations.
So it's not about lecturing or dictating, it's about collaboration and co-creation.
Precisely. Because the future of democracy depends on our ability to bridge those generational divides. Tap into the energy and idealism of young people, and create a system that reflects the diverse needs and aspirations of all citizens.
So we've explored potential solutions ranging from education and institutional reform to engaging young people and rethinking our models of democracy. But the real question is, how do we translate these ideas into action? What concrete steps can individuals take to make a difference? So we've explored the challenge of facing democracy, and we've brainstormed some potential solutions. But I think a lot of our listeners out there are probably thinking, okay, but what can I do? What can I, as one person, actually do to make a difference? It can all feel so overwhelming.
Yeah, and that feeling, that sense of powerlessness, that's exactly what those seeking to undermine democracy want you to feel. They want you to feel like your voice doesn't matter, like you can't make a difference. But remember, democracy thrives on the active participation of its citizens. Your actions, even seemingly small ones. They can have a ripple effect.
So let's get specific. What are some tangible actions our listeners can take?
Well, it all starts with being an informed and engaged citizen. Go beyond just the headlines and sound bites, really dig deeper into the issues, explore diverse perspectives, and develop informed opinions.
So be a critical consumer of information, not just passively absorbing whatever floats by on social media.
Exactly. And don't just consume information. Share it. Engage in thoughtful conversations with friends, family, and colleagues. You might be surprised at the impact you can have in shaping opinions and raising awareness within your own circles.
It's about fostering those habits of dialogue and critical thinking, which seem to be fading in our increasingly polarized world.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, there's voting. I know it might seem obvious, but it really is the bedrock of democratic participation.
Right.
Make sure you're registered. Research the candidates and issues, and cast your vote in every election, no matter how small.
But what about those who feel like their vote doesn't really count, like the system is rigged against them?
I understand that cynicism, I really do. But remember, democracy is a numbers game. The more people participate, the harder it becomes to ignore their voices. And don't underestimate the power of local elections. They often have a more direct impact on your daily life than national races.
So it's about finding those points of leverage, those areas where your involvement can make a tangible difference.
Precisely. And voting is just the starting point. Volunteer for a cause you believe in, join a local advocacy group, or contact your elected officials to express your views. These actions demonstrate that you're not just a passive observer, but an active participant in shaping your community and your country.
It's about taking ownership of your role as a citizen and using the tools of democracy to make your voice heard.
And remember, there's strength in numbers. Joining forces with others who share your concerns, that amplifies your impact, and it puts pressure on decision makers to actually listen. That's how movements for change gain momentum.
The Gambia case study really highlighted that, the power of collective action, both domestically and internationally.
100%. And, supporting organizations like Freedom House that promote democracy and human rights globally, that's another way to make a difference. Even seemingly small actions, like donating or simply raising awareness about their work, it all contributes to their efforts.
So it's about recognizing those connections between our individual actions and the broader global struggle for democracy.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the impact of your everyday choices. Support businesses that align with your values, advocate for ethical consumption and fair trade practices, and just be conscious. Make conscious decisions about where you spend your money. These seemingly small acts can send powerful signals, and they contribute to a more just and equitable world.
It's about recognizing that democracy isn't just a political system, but a set of values that should permeate every aspect of our lives.
100%. It's about making choices that reflect those values, whether it's in the voting booth, the marketplace, or your interactions with others.
So it's not about waiting for someone else to fix the system. It's about taking responsibility for our own roles in shaping a more democratic future.
Yeah, and remembering that democracy is a constant work in progress. It requires vigilance, participation, and a willingness to engage in the messy, sometimes frustrating, but ultimately rewarding work of self-governance.
We started this deep dive with John Quincy Adams' rather bleak assessment of democracy's fragility. But I think we've shown that its fate isn't predetermined.
I agree. Democracy's survival hinges on our collective action, our willingness to engage, to hold our leaders accountable, and to never stop believing in the power of our voices.
To our listeners out there, I encourage you to delve deeper into the sources we've discussed. Continue exploring these issues and find your own ways to contribute to a more just and democratic world.
Remember, the future is not something that just happens to us. It's something we create together through our choices and our actions.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay hopeful.